This program was made possible by the Lincoln Ethics Series, funded by the David and Joan Lincoln Family Fund for Applied Ethics and the McCready Family Fund.
Welcome to CHQ Assembly. My name is Matt Ewalt, and I serve Chautauqua Institution as Vice President and Emily and Richard Smucker Chair for Education. It's a privilege to welcome you to the Chautauqua Lecture Series program. Today's program is part of a week titled The Ethics of Tech, Scientific, Corporate, and Personal Responsibility, in which we grapple with the outsized and sometimes harmful role of technology in our lives and society. Should big tech companies, as their sheer size and influence raise antitrust questions, be permitted to self-police? Or is an industry-wide code of ethics or government regulation necessary to ensure safety in a future dominated by artificial intelligence, datafication, and facial recognition? Our guides this week are some of the top thinkers on technological advancements and the ethical conundrums they present. They will provide guidance on how we can take personal responsibility as consumers and users. Today we present a panel discussion in partnership with Carnegie Mellon University with a trio of university professors based in Pittsburgh: David Danks, Jennifer Keating, and Illah Nourbakhsh. Dr. Danks is the L.L. Thurstone Professor of Philosophy and Psychology and head of the Department of Philosophy at CMU. His research interests are at the intersection of philosophy, cognitive science, and machine learning, using ideas, methods, and frameworks from each to advance our understanding of complex interdisciplinary problems. Dr. Danks is also providing a lecture for the African American Heritage House series, which you can find on the CHQ Assembly platform. Dr. Keating formerly served as Assistant Dean for Educational Initiatives at Dietrich College of Social Sciences at CMU, but is now a senior lecturer and writing the discipline specialist in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh, just down Forbes Avenue. Her teaching focuses on the societal influences of advancing technology in political and social strife in Ireland. Dr. Nourbakhsh is the K&L Gates Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies at CMU, and also Director of the Community Robotics, Education, and Technology Empowerment Lab, and Associate Director for Faculty at the Robotics Institute. He also is CEO of AirViz, Inc., a company dedicated to empowering individuals regarding home air quality. Dr. Keating and Dr. Nourbakhsh are co-authors of the recently released book, AI and Humanity, an examination of the implications for society of rapidly advancing artificial intelligence systems, combining a humanities perspective with technical analysis. We are so honored to have these three brilliant scholars with us today for a live panel discussion. Before we begin today's Chautauqua Lecture program, our live audience should know that you may submit questions for our Q&A with the panel through the submission portal at questions.chq.org from any mobile or desktop browser, or on Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2020. Chautauqua, we are pleased to present to you Dr. David Danks, Dr. Jennifer Keating, and Dr. Illah Nourbakhsh. Good morning. Good morning to those of us joining from around the country for this program as part of our week on the ethics of tech. I'd like to welcome our three scholars this morning, Illah, Jen, and David, on screen, and just talk a little bit more about the format for the day. Hello to all of you, by the way. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So let's preview a bit of how we're going to go about this morning's program. We are, of course, going to have our moderated Q&A later on, and so certainly encourage those tuning in to be using our questions portal at questions.chq.org during the program. But what we've done is identified several different issues that we want to dig into today, and each of our scholars are going to do a program of about 6 or 7 minutes covering that issue, and then we'll jump to the next issue. And so we're going to be able to, in a short amount of time, actually cover a number of issues related to both artificial intelligence and thinking about ethics of tech in the classroom and more broadly in society. Illah is going to begin looking at the impact of artificial intelligence on society. Jen's going to be looking at AI surveillance and political strife. David's going to be looking at the specific case of predictive policing. And then Illah is going to make a shift to think about how do we bring ethics of tech into the classroom, particularly with computer science education. Jen's going to look at what that means more broadly in other classrooms and disciplines as well. And then we'll have David close looking at how we bring some of those ethical considerations into organizations. Then, of course, as I've said, we'll go into our moderated Q&A. So as I have you all on screen, thank you again for joining us and preparing for today. And with that, I will turn it over to Illah to get us started.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Matt. It is an honor to be part of the Chautauqua Institute's week on ethics and technology. AI, artificial intelligence, is something that is deeply aspirational for us as human beings because it's our first chance to really try and mimic the human and the values of the human and to stretch that out and have a system that's computational that does some of the thinking that we do for us. But we want to talk about concerns today. And the big question is, how do we navigate the question of the concerns that we have about AI and the ways in which that changes culture and society? And I know Jen as well, are big fans of shared grammar. So I'm going to start us off with 3 words that I think help us navigate the question of the ways in which AI pushes back on humanity and influences humanity itself. So word number 1 is agency. Agency, that sense of personal autonomy that we feel. You know, what's funny about AI is that when we afford to AI the ability to make decisions for us, we don't necessarily know how those decisions get made by the AI system, because in fact the best AI systems are black boxes. They make decisions somewhat without the knowledge of even the computer designers understanding how it works. We don't necessarily know why they make the decisions they make, because often they can't justify decisions because they're not metacognitive like us. You can't interrogate them like you can human beings. And we aren't sure what their impact is going to be. And the obvious example I'll start you with is the Boeing 737 MAX, where in fact AI is able to perform as well as a pilot or better 99% of the time. The problem is what happens in that 0.001% of the time when the AI system flying the airplane does a worse job than the pilot, and the pilot doesn't know what's going on because they've lacked agency. It's been taken away from them. So fundamentally, the challenge isn't can the AI system do well most of the time. The challenge is what happened to the relationship between agency, autonomy, decision-making, and the human being when you afford the AI the ability to make decisions. That's agency. Number 2, equity. You've probably heard the stories of things like credit approval and the questions of digital bias, particularly data bias and algorithmic bias. If we're going to have credit approval done by an AI system for a credit card or a mortgage application, by the way, those are true stories. That actually happens today. Those systems learn from the way humans have done mortgage application approvals and denials in the past. So they learn to have precisely the same biases implicitly that were implicit in the way people behaviorally acted in the past. Yet they hide them within their own complex black box structure as an AI system. So we get stuck with an inequitable situation in which you may have racial bias baked into an algorithm that was not racial to begin with, but in fact has subsumed all the raciality in our society automatically. So equity is a funny situation because the AI systems we look at as a computer system, we think that they're going to be fairer than we are. But we don't know how to make a shadow of ourselves fairer than us. All we know how to make is something that's just like us, and that's a bit of a challenge. The third one I want to talk about after agency and equity is power. And this is a deep one, because in fact, what's interesting about AI is that it can do what we cannot do. You can hire ad folks to make wonderful advertisements that you watch on the internet or at a Macy's store. And I'm dating myself. I'm sorry. I'm from the age when we had stores before COVID and you'd walk into the store and you had ads in the store. You can ask your grandparents about that. They can explain what that was like. But an AI system can do billions of experiments on each one of us, sizing up our gender, our age, our wealth categorization online and in the real world, and then present bespoke ads to us to cause us to behave a certain way. And by doing literally billions of experiments like that with A/B testing, the AI system can influence and manipulate the decisions we make, the desires we have, how we spend money. That sounds pretty scary. It's just advertisement, but done better than people could do. But when you amp it up like that, the balance of power changes. And the power negotiation between consumer and producer or marketer of good changes. But you know where I'm going with this, right? It's not just about marketing and capitalism. It's about democracy. Because you can do the same thing, and of course, Cambridge Analytica famously claimed that they could do the same thing by creating highly bespoke advertising to the best bidder on political campaigns. And when you do that, you manipulate information in such a way as to push exactly the right buttons on each of us to cause us to vote the way that the payer of the system wants us to vote. And in a way, that's almost like inventing a universal remote control. You know, the joke about making a universal remote where you walk into any bar, anywhere, you hit the button, and it turns off the TVs. So thankfully, you can finally have a drink in silence. Well, universal remote that controls all of us and the way we vote is a scary thing because it pushes back on our personal agency. Get back to that other keyword. It changes the dynamics of democracy when our vote is based on information that's highly mediated and therefore not balanced. And that's the fundamental question of power relationship. AI can make the world better, but in doing so, it can actually exacerbate inequities. It can exacerbate unequal power relationships, and it can increase a sense of lack of agency that people can have. And power and the question of power and politics is incredibly important. I teach on this in the world of drones, of course. There's an excellent book called Drone Theory by Shamayou that talks to that. But I'm going to turn over the microphone now to Jen, who's going to talk about power and political strife. Jen.
Thank you, Illah. So as Illah mentioned, thinking about a couple of thematic threads when we're attending to a large conversation that really focuses on the ways in which these technological advancements affect our relationships to these tools, but then by virtue of those relationships, they also affect our relationships to one another. It seems that thinking about the role of AI in regards to surveillance and political strife is both timely, but also a historic circumstance that's worthwhile investigating a little bit further. I'm really interested in the connections between societal strife, information gathering, and the ways that that affects power negotiations, and the ways that that relationship has been narrated. Literary work oftentimes gives us examples of these narrations that capture our imagination. So I hope you'll indulge with me as I take a look at a recent novel. In 2018, the Booker Prize was awarded to Anna Burns for her novel Milkman. And in this, one of the central protagonists' middle sister laments the following: I decided to forgive brother-in-law for his out-of-character criticism, which is what I did. Then a tree by the top reservoir took a picture of us as we ran by. This hidden camera clicked, just one click, as state forces click, in the similar way to how that bush, positioned along this same reservoir, had done a week earlier. Oh dear, I thought. I hadn't considered that. What I meant was, I hadn't considered that the state would now associate anyone I was associating with also with the milkman, as they were associating me now with the milkman. Already within a week of that first click, I'd been clicked again 4 times. Once had been in town, once had been walking into town, then twice coming out of town. I'd been photographed from a car, from a seemingly disused building, also from other bits of greenery. Perhaps, too, there's been other clicks I hadn't picked up on at the time. Each occasion when I did hear them, the camera would snap as I passed by, so yes, it seemed I'd fallen into some grid, maybe the central grid, as part of the disease, the rebel infection. And now others in my company, such as poor innocent brother-in-law, were to be implicated also as associates of an associate. Brother-in-law, however, just had the milkman completely ignore the click. Why are you ignoring that click? I asked. I always ignore the clicks, he said. What do you expect me to do? Get outraged? Write letters? Keep a diary? Put in a complaint? Get one of my personal secretaries to contact the United Nations Amnesty International Ombudsman Human Rights Peaceful Demonstration people? Tell me, sister, who do I contact and what do I say? And while you're about it, what are you going to do about the click yourself? Well, I was going to have amnesia, of course. In fact, here I was, already having it. I don't know what you mean, I said. I've forgotten it. His forthrightness having sent me immediately into jamais vu. According to the Booker Prize chair judges, Kwame Anthony Appiah claims the novel delineates brilliantly the power of gossip and societal pressure in a tight-knit community and shows how both rumor and political loyalties can be put in the service of a relentless campaign of individual sexual harassment. Burns draws on the experience in Northern Ireland during the Troubles to portray a world that allows individuals to abuse the power granted by a community to those who resist the state on their behalf, end quote. So as you see here, the Booker Prize judges respond to the humanity encapsulated in the aesthetics of Burns's novel, just as much as the content that really is capturing this notion of power negotiations in a ghettoized community under severe duress. But what I am really interested in considering as we follow up with our current discussions also is what's at stake and how does it relate to AI and humanity? How does brother-in-law's response indicate this sense of powerless that individuals may feel in the face of this notion of blanketed state surveillance? How do middle sister and brother-in-law respectively illustrate a sense of paralysis in the face of these technological tools used in the service of the state to quell interruptions to a dominant political status quo? So the panopticon of clicks from greenery, from a car, the seemingly disused building suggests not only the gathering information through these images and through gossip, but also the much more sinister suggestion of their networking of that information and the concept in the present day of what it means to network that information and then have scaled connections that then precipitate particular actions on the part of the state on its own citizenry. Middle sister extrapolates, quote, each occasion when I did hear them, the camera would snap as I passed. And so, yes, it seemed I'd fallen into some grid, maybe the central grid as part of the disease, the rebel infection, end quote. And the sense of outrage she articulates is rendered pretty ineffectual quite quickly. And that's a theme that runs throughout the course of the novel. Brother-in-law's powerlessness in the face of the perceived omnipotent power of the state and the non-state rebels render the individual paralyzed as they are caught in between these power negotiations on the part of the non-state actors and the state. The only logical pathway in that context within the novel is a claustrophobic portrayal of the working class ghetto and the continental practice of jamais vu. So if we're thinking about other historic examples that have us really thinking about these implications of human-human relationships in relation to these tools for surveillance, another deep past example is the Pass Book in apartheid-era South Africa. This was a book that logged passes for Black individuals to move from Black-only townships to places of employment, presumably in white-only districts, whether it's domestic workers in white homes or professionals in predominantly white-owned businesses, or in districts where the businesses were predominantly white-owned. What if today's technological advancements had applied to such restricted in movement? What level of scale could have pushed down this already vulnerable population to quell any form of resistance or rebellion? What form of political organization that resists the National Party status quo could have been quelled by virtue of these scaled tools? And what if predictive policing measures from the current day used a scaled version of passbooks as a foundational concept to develop the tools that gather information and restrict movement of individuals associated with any given, quote, rebel infection, end quote, perhaps to maintain a central grid in today's Hong Kong, perhaps to control the movement of Black Lives Matter protesters in Portland, Oregon, maybe in Chicago, or maybe in Washington, D.C. I'm going to hand it on now to David to talk about the specific case of predictive policing within this context.
Thanks so much, Jen. And I think one of the things that we need to think about when we start with this issue of predictive policing and the use of data and AI for law enforcement purposes is a recognition that while these are sometimes proposed and used explicitly for control purposes, in many other cases, they're proposed and pursued out of, I think, a more benign motivation. And the motivation is, why wouldn't we want to use data to improve policing? We know that there are issues with law enforcement. This has been known for a long time, not just, it's not a new discovery in the last few months. And if we have data, if we have technology that is, as people tend to think about algorithms, not
explicitly racist, that doesn't hate. Algorithms don't have emotions, as Illah was noting. And so we might hope that these algorithms could be more objective and that we could use data to somehow improve policing. Of course, the question that immediately arises, even from this kind of more altruistic or community-minded motivation, is what do we mean by improve? Does improve mean more arrests? Does improve mean fewer crimes? Does improve mean an increased sense of safety? All of these are different things that we might want our algorithm to aspire to do. And of course, there's a second follow-on question that immediately arises. For whom? Fewer crimes for whom? Increased sense of safety for whom? And we need to think about what is it we're trying to achieve when we pursue predictive policing. Now, unfortunately, as I think hopefully we all now recognize, there's a very long history of law enforcement and governments using technologies for surveillance and control rather than purely for safety and support. There have been a long history of biased policing practices that differentially focus on some groups, and particularly communities of color. These are the sorts of long-standing practices that one finds throughout the US and in fact throughout the world that have led to many of the protests that we've seen across this country over the last 8 to 12 weeks. And even, of course, prior to that, they're not at the same scale. Now, given these long histories, we might worry if we just naively tried to use data to improve policing, what would happen? Well, as Illah noted in his first remarks, what AI and machine learning really learn to do is they will learn to replicate whatever they see in the data that we provide them, what we refer to as the training data. It's the information from which the algorithm, the AI system, can learn. Now, the problem is that what it really is learning to do is simply mirror whatever patterns are found in those training data. So if the training data embody and measure practices that are themselves biased, that are targeted for surveillance, that aim to increase control or increase policing of communities of color, well, then that's exactly what our predictive policing AI algorithm is going to learn to do. We set out, even from the benign motivation, the altruistic, perhaps even, motivation of using data to improve policing. But instead, what we get is we get an algorithm that objectively mirrors back at us our own historic systemic cultural biases. And so if we are not careful about how we create these kinds of systems, all we will do is create new tools to perpetuate imbalances of power and structural inequities, to tie back to terms that you've been hearing over the last 12 to 15 minutes. At its core, the real issue here with predictive policing systems and with all of these AI technological systems is to ask ourselves, what are the values and interests that are literally embodied or implemented in the technology? Now, many people, I think, conceive of technology as something that's value neutral. There's no value in the ones and zeros. It's just code in my computer. It's just code on my phone. How could that have values? But I think it's important to realize that all technologies have values. They embody values through what they prioritize. They embody values by what they make it easier and harder to do. If you have a hammer, it embodies the value that everything's a nail. And in practice, most of these AI systems aim to optimize. They tend to be high performing at some task. And so they embody the value that this task, whether it's predicting where a crime will occur, or predicting where an arrest might occur, or predicting who might feel a sense of insecurity and lack of safety as they walk the streets of their own communities. Whatever task we set to the AI system and optimize it to solve, that is the value that we've baked into our technologies from the outset. The questions that we choose to ask, the challenges that we choose to solve, that's the way that values make their way into technology, even from the outset. And in the case of predictive policing, it makes it all the more important that from the outset we ask, what does it really mean to improve policing? And what is it that we're going to be able to achieve potentially using data? So the outcome of a racist, biased, predictive policing system that simply perpetuates past inequities, that's actually not inevitable. We could, in theory, at least, use AI and data to improve policing. but only if we do it with care, reflection, community engagement, and deep thoughtfulness. So how on earth do we get those kinds of improved and ethical uses of AI? Well, what we need to think about is we need to think seriously about how we can, in practice, on the ground, both teach the next generation of technologists how to produce more ethical AI, and also how to implement those practices of ethical AI in our organizations, in our universities, in our governments. So what I'd like to do now is pass the baton back to Illah to talk a bit about ways to bring ethics to computer science education with the goal of being able to achieve exactly these ends of ethical AI. Illah?
Thank you, David. So now that we've thoroughly concerned you about AI, I think David made the critical pipeline point, which is the only way to bend the arc of justice into AI in the future is to make sure the inventors, the innovators of the future actually have their thinking hats on. And that's more than just awareness, right? That is skill. It means, do they understand ethics deeply enough to integrate it into the practice of design, into the practice of how they decide to invent for the world? So I started teaching CS education classes in 1997 at CMU, and before that I taught some at Stanford. And I want to explain how different the evolution of students has gone over these last 20 odd years of embarrassingly long time that I've been teaching. If you look at computer science education in the late 90s, it was mostly a theoretical field. We were excited to treat it like a math discipline, where we're inventing and discovering whole new algorithms and processes. How do we recognize a red ball in a picture? And then what happened is Google came along. And people, the students that we had, were super excited because Google's message was not just don't be evil or do no evil, but rather organizing the world's information. So students privileged the idea of information and the idea that they can play a role in helping people answer questions all over the world. And so the goodness that they saw in computer science education was that they basically go and become a millionaire working for a Google and making a lot of money, but solving a fundamental problem people have, which is answering their questions. And that stuck for years. But there's an interesting transition that happened, which is gradually Facebook and Google became broad, right? They started doing more and more in our world. And the students that I have started recognizing the greater and greater degree of change happening to culture and society due to those very tools. So Facebook helps us connect to our friends. Great. But wait, they were running experiments showing pessimistic and optimistic news stories to people to see how they react emotionally. Interesting. That's a little bit different. And Google is organizing our information. Great. But they're integrating paid content, sponsored content with truth content in such a way that you can't tell the difference necessarily. Interesting. And so what I started seeing is graduates of our programs in the early 2000s actually emailing me back and saying, you know, could you come and do a lecture to my group at Google on ethics? Because we're getting into some spaces that I'm uncomfortable with. And that was really interesting to see that they had a desire, a hunger to learn more about how they could apply what they were using in university to that. Now, fast forward to today, and things have changed in a kind of dramatic fashion. The millennials don't care about becoming millionaires anymore. They don't even care about organizing the world's information anymore. In fact, I have students who come to my office and sit down, pre-COVID admittedly, and say, I'm getting this CS degree. I don't want to go optimize ad revenue for a company. What am I supposed to do with my degree? What's going on is a fundamental recognition, especially by millennials, that the code they write changes and influences society. It changes power relationships in society. So our students have become hungry for understanding how they can have positive social impact because they've realized that CS code can have social impact. And that's simply a dot we had not connected in the 90s or the 80s. I remember. So fundamentally, the disconnect that we have is that there's entire fields, entire disciplines that have a long history of ethics training because they know they have societal impact. I'm thinking of fields like civil engineering. You build a bridge in civil engineering. You abide by the ABET ethics code because it's very important that the bridge you build can have your mark of confidence that nobody's going to die when you design that bridge and build it and put it out in the world. Because a civil engineer changes the world. It pushes back on how people move and therefore the risk people accept. Civil engineering and many engineering disciplines have ethics training specifically because they influence the world, as does medicine. But guess what? CS doesn't. Most of the master's and undergraduate degrees in CS across the country still, even to this day, as the pitch for this has become intensified, don't have an explicit requirement for ethics training, even though the data that you collect and then run algorithms on, the surveillance that you do vis-a-vis what Jen said, and the algorithms that you invent vis-a-vis predictive policing, as David pointed out, all have direct impact on society, just like a bridge builder. Yet, because we came from a tradition of theoretical math, we never thought in the design of the curriculum that we were having influence on society, so we didn't bother with the question of ethics training. I'll close with my dear friend at Harvard, Barbara Gross, who's a professor there, who designed a way of taking every class in CS and integrating a bit of ethics into it. So that, for instance, when you learn how to do face recognition in your computer science machine learning class in computer vision, then she has a week during which the students argue what are the pros and cons of recognizing faces? How does China use face recognition today? And what can we as designers and implementers do to ensure that face recognition as a technology is used in ways that are pro-social and not antisocial? These are questions we didn't used to ask ever in a technology class. After all, we have too much to teach them about the how-tos of the engineering discipline itself. But what Barbara saw at Harvard was we need repeated, consistent, ritualized exposure to these ethics questions in every class they take in CS, if we want it to sink into them that every time they invent something in a company, they need to ask these same ritualized questions and queries and feel a personal agency to make decisions that comport with their ethics and not just with their skill. So that's fundamentally about the CS side of it. I'm going to turn it over to Jen now because, in fact, this is much bigger than just computer science. Jen, go ahead.
Thanks, Illah. So I think as David was framing the concerns associated with predictive policing and this notion of precisely articulating the questions, who is policing? Policing for whom? What is safety? How is that defined? How do you engage with a community to ensure what the features and the values are associated with community policing? That's a form of inquiry that really attends to the stakeholders that are involved and really has the notion of individual and communal responsibility at the heart of the work. Similarly, as Illah's talking a little bit about ethics and Barbara Gross's impetus to intertwine ethics into the fundamental features of CS education, again, we're talking about the ways in which inquiry is intertwined into the technical training as fundamental. These cannot be divorced from one another as technologies continue to thread through our everyday lives. Responsible design is integral to educational practices. IEEE has done tremendous work in this area and continues to do work in this area as well. I'm not an ethicist. That's not what I've done in terms of my educational training, but as an educator in my own classroom and in scaled curricular design that I've been responsible for some years now, I do believe that we have an ethical responsibility to teach our students, regardless of their discipline, a mode of inquiry that underscores the ethical responsibility to question the tools that they're designing, if that's in engineering, CS, machine learning, statistics, but also to think about the ways in which individuals are using these tools, to develop also skills in communicating how they're using these tools within the context of their own discipline and work, and to think about how these tools are used in any form of action that will have implications for a broader public. So how do we actually go about doing that? One of the values that I think is important in regards to this kind of curricular design is to fundamentally help students understand that inquiry is a mode of societal responsibility. When we're thinking about our educational designs, we can equip students quite early in their study with models of inquiry that frame really complex problems, like the influence and implications of using tools like artificial intelligence for tasks that include consequential decision-making. As we model modes of inquiry as instructors, we're basically empowering our students to try on different lines of questions so that over the course of time, we can remove that scaffolding and equip the students with method and confidence to basically fashion these lines of inquiry for themselves. We're basically removing the training wheels, so to speak, for these problem-solving skills. At CMU, one example of our curricular design in the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the first-year interdisciplinary Grand Challenge seminars offer students opportunities to undertake problem-based inquiry as the basis for their first-year courses. Classes like A in Humanity, which I've taught with Illah a couple of times, classes like Climate Change, Racism is Real, or Me Too, Gender-Based Violence, model interdisciplinary faculty teams framing pretty gnarly societal problems, and the demonstration of how collaborative work amongst the faculty can suggest inroads to solving complex and sometimes historically persistent problems. Moving from the first-year seminars that cross colleges, students can then go on to consider responsible design in an AI undergraduate major in the School of Computer Science, a reflexive minor in societal and human impacts of future technologies that allows social science and humanities students to study advancing technologies in statistics, machine learning, or computer science, or that allow technically oriented students to undertake studies in science communication, ethics, or the history of science and technology. Basically, these modes of formal studies empower the individual students, but also groups of students to undertake this responsibility of developing and honing their skills for inquiry so that their individual and collective responsibility can be assumed in the classroom, but almost as importantly as they navigate the world as leaders and as responsible citizens after graduation. So let's also think about the ways in which action can serve as another form of societal responsibility. I'm of the opinion that our students undertaking higher education, but also all citizens, need to be equipped with the tools to frame the pressing questions that arise in our human-to-human relationships that are also shaped by these rapidly advancing tools, but also our own interactions with these systems and tools as well. How are we to assume an empowered posture if we have little idea of the limits or the sophistication of the tools with which we work or that affect our own everyday lives? That black box notion that Illah touched upon is something that I think is incredibly dubious and worthwhile continuing to pry open as best we can. To what degree are the designers of these tools responsible for communicating their capabilities and their limitations with greater transparency? What actions and by whom will ensure regulation of these tools in circumstances that include highly consequential decision-making, the introduction of drones to modern warfare, something that Illah touched on, and that's obviously a huge concern at the moment. But all of these inquiries and responsibilities are within our grasp across the disciplines in the academy, but we're also responsible for assisting in communicating and teaching the next generation to communicate, regardless of discipline, as they design, they build, and they use these tools in their current and future work. We can also facilitate students and citizens' empowerment as we study and help shape our individual and collective relationships to these very systems as they continue to come online and then be integrated in different parts of our lives. So as an example of this kind of work, Illah and I have written a book, AI in Humanity. It's pretty user-friendly. The effort there is to really start to bring a historical framing and a lexicon to this relationship to these technological tools, and basically to erase and remove the shrouds of mystery that might be associated with these efforts. David Danks has designed and started to deliver just last year. We sent him one student, the Shift minor, that's also working in this direction with reflexive opportunities for students to integrate this work into their study regardless of their primary focus. Reed Simmons has designed and delivered a new AI undergraduate major in the School of Computer Science. And he's really thought quite carefully about this integration of ethics into those courses as well as we're training the next generation of computer scientists. In the coming years, as I take on a new role at the Writing Institute at Pitt, I'm planning to assist faculty across disciplines to teach responsible communication practices. I'll be collaborating with my colleagues in the composition program in the Department of English to scale up curricular offerings in the newly launched Certificate in Public Communication in Science and Technology and a new major in Digital Narrative Interactive Design. Basically, the intellectual and the cultural landscape is quite rich. And if we harness the opportunity, we needn't fall into the paralytical posture like brother-in-law in Burns's epic novel Milkman, but instead shape our relationships to one another and to the very tools that we design to shape our lives, our work, and our society. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to David so he can talk a little bit about how we can integrate these ethical threads into business practices and other forms of public work.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to everyone watching. We're on the home stretch, I promise. We're getting close to the Q&A session here. As a professor, obviously I care deeply about education and as Jen mentioned, have contributed to some of these kinds of educational initiatives that she and Illah were mentioning. At the same time, we obviously can't wait for the next generation. The challenges of AI and technology are here now, the ethical and societal challenges, and we really need ways for industry, governments, other organizations to do better now, not to do better in 10 years when the next generation is fully into the workforce. So how can we achieve that? Well, the fundamental insight, I think, for any organization is to recognize, to put it into bumper sticker form, that ethical AI, ethical technology, is the process, not the product. So if you want to have more ethical technology, if you want to have more responsible or societally engaged technology, and including AI, you can't just build cool tech and then slap some ethics on at the end. That isn't how it works, and it's never going to achieve the goals that you really have in mind. Now with students, what we can do is we can help to teach them from the very beginning how to think through these processes of responsible design, ethical awareness, societal scanning, where you try to understand the consequences of the technology you're considering building. What do you do if you're running an organization, though? You are, in some sense, having to rebuild things while your ship is out to sea, hopefully not in too big a storm, though after the last few months, it feels like everything is a continual storm in society. So how can organizations begin to address these ethical and societal issues throughout what we could think of as the design, develop, deploy life cycle of technology? How do we not have ethical and societal considerations just be an add-on at the end, but rather be integrated throughout these life cycles? Well, there's a growing amount of work that's happening, whether in think tanks, in companies, or in academia, working to develop concrete actions that organizations can take to improve their ability to produce technology in an ethical and societally responsible way. So let me just give a few examples just to sort of whet your appetite. We can give many more in the Q&A if people are interested. So at the most concrete, an organization might recognize that most of their employees didn't have the luxury of being a CMU student. They may not have gotten this kind of education. And so they are going to need support in understanding when are there ethical challenges and when is this something that, the technology is probably not going to present any significant ethical issues. How do we help people have a kind of ethical triage or societal triage to recognize which technological ideas actually pose very deep challenges that they should discuss with somebody else? And how do we then provide the scaffolding and support for those employees so that they can reason through these challenges themselves, or perhaps connect with experts, whether within the organization or outside of the organization, to really figure out what they should do? So multiple of us have been developing exactly these kinds of, whether it's a simple worksheet. I mean, that sounds very banal and boring, but those kinds of process improvements can help ensure that ethical and societal challenges are not recognized at the very end, but rather are recognized at the very beginning of the design, develop, deploy life cycle. We increasingly are seeing companies and governments who are developing and establishing ethics advisory boards or responsible use advisory councils so that they can get guidance and feedback about how to use and build technology in more responsible ways. Of course, some of those boards have very limited power and are not going to be able to make a real difference for the company. Others are able to have significant authority to change the processes, to censor particular projects and say, no, as a company, we ought not do that because it poses too many ethical or societal challenges. As companies are increasingly using data, we're seeing more and more both internal and external audit capabilities being created so that if I'm developing a new technology to do diagnosis of the potential, for example, of people who might potentially have low blood pressure events during surgery, and I want to make an algorithm that's going to predict this so we can improve healthcare, I need to have either internal or external audits that can check my algorithm for bias. Does it actually perform equally well for Black and white and Hispanic individuals? Does it perform equally well for men and for women? We need to have increased, regular, sustained monitoring and follow-up of technologies. The reality is people, society, technology, context, they all change. And so companies need to not simply build technology, throw it out over the wall into society, and then walk away. They need to continue to see, how does the technology change? How does society change in response to the technology? Facebook did not present nearly the ethical challenges that it does now when it was first created. There were ethical challenges back then, but they've changed as Facebook has changed and as society has changed. And perhaps at the highest level, it's important for organizations to really deliberately articulate the values that they have as an organization and question the ways in which the technology that they're designing, developing, and deploying either does or perhaps does not implement and embody those values. Remember that technology is not value neutral. And so companies need to significantly reflect on whether they're doing the things that actually follow through on what they claim to value and believe in. I personally have found when I work with companies, oftentimes they come to me and say, we need ethical help. And my response to say, no, you know what you should do. You just have to decide that you're willing to do it. It's not an ethical question about the technology. It's a question about what kind of company are you? And are you willing to take the steps to live up to your values? And of course, so many of those things are not just true about organizations. They're also true about all of us. We all should be trying to articulate our own values and trying to engage and empower ourselves to use just those technologies that actually advance your interests, not your company's interests. As a personal anecdote, I'm essentially not on social media. The reason is because I've realized, I decided this several years ago, that social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, were not supporting my values and interests. They weren't empowering me, but rather were empowering those companies. And so I made a deliberate decision to simply remove myself. Now that's a decision that is not going to be the same for everybody. Plenty of other people use these platforms successfully to advance their own values. But it's important for us to reflect on what it is that we want from the world and engage with technology in that way so that we can all have more ethical and societally responsible technologies. So thanks to all of you who joined this morning. Thank you to the Chautauqua Institution for inviting the three of us to be a part of this panel and this outstanding, exceptional week. And now I'll hand it back to Matt for a moderated Q&A session about the ethical and societal impacts of AI technology and what we can do about them.
Well, David, thank you so much for that. And just a reminder to folks that David's lecture as part of the African American Heritage House series will be this afternoon at 3:30 here on CHQ Assembly. So we appreciate his kind of playing double duty here for us, but plenty to unpack this week. And to Jen and Illah, thank you so much as well for really taking us through a number of different issues that we can unpack, but particularly then taking a step back and thinking about what it means for tomorrow's tech leaders and how do we think about this kind of ethics training. And I should say not just for tech leaders, but indeed those who are looking to careers in a number of different disciplines and professions. I do want to remind people that you can ask your questions using our submission portal at questions.chq.org. And for those of you who are on social media, you can ask your questions on Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2020. But to begin, Illah, I wanted to go back to a point that you made about what you're seeing in millennials and students today that may not be looking to be that next millionaire or billionaire, but are actually entering school with determination to make a positive social impact. And I was immediately reminded that strong commitment also comes, and certain set of values comes at a time where a lot of universities around the country are also being criticized by some conservatives for kind of narrowing or reducing opportunities for free speech or for challenging viewpoints. So how do you balance a kind of learning environment where you want to respect students who come in with a fierce desire to affect meaningful change, but at the same time challenge assumptions, challenge bias, and just engage in that larger inquiry that you all have talked about today?
It's a great question. The millennials, the mindset I've seen when I kind of interrogate them on their headspace, a lot of it has to do with frustration and disappointment that prior generations have failed the globe, essentially, in terms of politics, in terms of capitalism and economic inequity, and actually in terms of climate change. It turns out a lot of people I talk to say, look, you guys have completely failed us on this. We have to take the reins and do something more intelligent than what all the prior generations did to save the planet, to save people, and to create more equitable societies. So that's what seems to drive them, is not just a hopefulness to make the world better, but a fear that the world is basically what's it called, hell in a handbasket, and it's going down, and they need to solve it and resolve it so that it doesn't go downhill badly. What's interesting is there is this whole thing that you hear that has to do with kind of a conservative opinion that we should have strong free speech on campuses. The way I see the millennials that I interact with, the kind of free speech that sometimes is propounded by conservatives has to do with what a lot of millennials would consider hate speech. It's the politics of division and siloing. And in fact, what they're more interested in is solution making. How do we find common ground? How do we empower our own generation to find and forge a path forward? And I think they're much less excited to have a 55-year-old person with whom they disagree show up on campus and be wise and talk to them about their heritage or their cultural heritage. Because frankly, they believe the 55-year-old wise man has failed them, the white 55-year-old wise man, and they want to take the reins themselves. So it's a funny dichotomy, because I think people grab onto the bandwagon of the millennials and then try and force them to pay attention to precisely what they're trying to say is not the right solution. What they want is effectively to incorporate change and to make change happen bottom up. And that's also part of what you see in terms of leaderlessness in some of these movements. You saw that kind of fail with Occupy Wall Street, right? The fact that there wasn't a movement agenda and a movement leader caused the whole thing to fizzle. But I think we're in a situation now where when you look at occupation and protest and action and enactment, millennials are able, in a much more effective way than prior generations, to have bottom-up structures where they can induce change and do so without a kind of top-down hierarchical view and without a kind of normalized sensibility that says, here's the 5 steps we want to sell the older generations on.
And I think if I could just jump in,
Please.
I think it's important to distinguish, and Illah was really doing this, I think, nicely, between free speech as what we might think of as sort of free pontification versus free inquiry and engagement. And I think what we, at least certainly what I see when I work with students, and I may be getting a biased sample by being in a philosophy department, but is a very deep understanding and appreciation of free inquiry and free engagement. That if you want to make a difference in the world, you're going to have to engage with other people. You're going to have to find these points of common ground so that you can build. The resistance that I see to students, or the maybe frustration is a better term, is often with the free pontification. I'm going to simply say things and then insulate myself or isolate myself from challenges. So I think in many cases, the concerns are not about people saying things to which others object. It's then an unwillingness to engage in dialogue, to actually talk through. Why do you think that? Why do you not understand the different perspective that I, as a 22-year-old in Pittsburgh, might have from a 55-year-old in London? How do we bridge these gaps? I think there is actually a hunger to bridge those by many of the students that we see on college campuses. And they're frustrated by the lack of venues to do that and the feeling that they're typically just being talked at rather than engaged with.
Thank you. Thank you both. And as we're going through, by the way, obviously with these questions, I may have one that is intended for one of our scholars today, but all of you are most encouraged to jump in, and if I have missed you, just go ahead and interrupt me, because I'm the least important here for this conversation. Jen, a question for you though, and I think you were touching on this issue a bit, and even I think representation of disciplines that you all represent today speaks to this issue. How much of these issues of ethics and empathy in tech and engineering, how much of this can be solved by simply breaking down university silos?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The silos in the university are part and parcel of the evolution of the university.
All right, so I do think that we're having some tech issues here. So we're going to try and see if we can go back to Jen. I think right now we are having. Oh, Jen, can you try again for us?
Can you hear me? Okay.
We can. Yeah. If you want to go ahead, and we'll try again.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the university is structured in such a way historically where the disciplines allowed for depths of knowledge to be explored over time, mid 19th century onwards, right? The disciplines continue to differentiate and divide as our mechanisms and methods evolve and allow us to delve more deeply into that particular form of knowledge. And alongside that evolution and proliferation of different disciplines, we've also had an incentive structure historically associated with the university that rewards, by and large, individual work, right? So you achieve tenure by publishing, undertaking research enterprises that are sometimes collective, but are led by an individual thinker. And so the incentive structure is one that is, by and large, individualistic, even if there is a common enjoyment of that developing knowledge across the university. Trying to break down those silos is very difficult because essentially the university is structured in such a way that disincentivizes that notion of collaboration. But what I will say is that sometimes younger institutions like Carnegie Mellon, there is this kind of scrappiness where people are interested, they're imaginative, and they're willing to basically reach out to collaborators in relatively disparate fields in order to attend some of these really persistent questions and problems. So it makes sense to a certain degree for a roboticist who is really becoming concerned with blind spots in their students' design development to reach out to an ethicist. It's a little bit weirder to reach out to a literary critic, maybe, but when you actually start to look at some of the language that even the EU has used to begin to prime conversations pertaining to regulation, the reference initially is to Frankenstein. The reference is to Rossum's Universal Robot. The reference to a play and to a novel demonstrate the ways in which these narratives, these literary allusions, capture our imagination and oftentimes drive what we think is possible. And so oftentimes the problems or just the insatiable curiosity of individual scholars will lead to perhaps desperation, right? Where you don't have the tools within your own discipline to just find someone to work with, to attend to those concerns, right? Many, many years ago, I was really concerned about military tech in the context of Northern Ireland and the ways in which that was further disempowering populations and the ways that people described it. I wanted to learn about the robotic systems that were used to detonate IRA bombs. So started to look around at roboticists at CMU and eventually found my way to Illah to ask about some of that work. And I think, in conversations David and I have had coming from a slightly different disciplinary lens than primary tech, oftentimes we can start to explore the societal and human contexts associated with a particular tool. So we might look at something like the cotton gin, right? We might look at something like the printing press. Benedict Anderson has written at length about the implications societally and politically of the printing press. But when you start to look at these cultural artifacts, the questions start to move in different directions. And then you start to really think about the individual scholars who have methodologies that come to attend to those questions in slightly different ways, which really lends itself to this notion of collaboration that I think is at the ethos of the university as it's initially conceived, even if those initial incentive structures don't necessarily align.
Thanks, Jen. David, this question is for you, but certainly for others to respond to as well, and it's around predictive policing. And the question specifically is the recently used law enforcement in Lafayette Square and Portland, is this data driven? Are there some examples of predictive policing happening there, or is it more politics at play? But then I guess if without those examples, helping us understand how else in everyday life can we see that predictive policing taking shape?
Yeah, a good question in a lot of ways. To the best that I think we can publicly find out, the actions in Lafayette Square, the current actions in Portland, the potential actions in Chicago, the recent removal of an Occupy tent city in New York, those do not seem to have been data driven. They seem to have been politics driven. And I think part of the reason is that we might think that is that there was nothing that signaled it coming, right? We didn't see any precursors of that would make us think this was a situation that was about to go badly for anybody when those law enforcement actions were put into place. But I think the deeper challenge is it's actually very, very hard to know if predictive policing techniques are being used in a city. Here in the city of Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police had a project going for over a year. It is not happening right now. The mayor stopped it and is not allowing it to restart because of concerns and questions about it. But they had a project going for over a year where the police would get guidance based on historical data about which parts of which police zones should be more heavily policed, that there should be more foot and car traffic by police in those regions. There was essentially no public disclosure of this. Communities were not notified that this was happening. It was just done under, policing practices change all the time, and so we're just changing policing practices just as we would do it, if we decided to, change out, instead of patrolling down this street, patrol down that street. It was viewed as just yet another small minor process change without a recognition of the ways that actually these kinds of changes can legitimate very problematic decisions that had historically happened. So I think one of the challenges is exactly figuring out how is your local government, whether predictive policing or allocation of benefits, how are they using algorithms? There is no standardized legislation in the United States right now, even sort of draft or template legislation, that municipalities, for example, could adopt or states could adopt. There are some efforts, more grassroots. So there was an effort in New York City to have an algorithms task force that would look to see whether the city of New York should be using algorithms in various ways. It had a lot of challenges to it. Here in Pittsburgh, we have a task force on public algorithms. That is a nonpartisan group that is actually, of which, full disclosure, I'm a member, that is devoted to trying to develop draft legislation that would hopefully be adopted here in the city about how and when public entities like governments should be allowed to use algorithms and data in the provision or removal of services to their citizens. Because right now, by and large, governments don't have to tell you, and it's an enormous, enormous problem.
You have time for a follow-on, Matt? I agree with everything David said. The crux of the issue has to do with information and information ownership. We don't have transparency in society about where information is being produced, how it's recorded, and then who has access to it. Simple example I'll give you. Access is a company, it's huge, collects credit card information and demographic information from all the different credit card companies, then recombines it and sells it back to each credit card company. So that, for instance, one of the Citibank MasterCards can find out what are all the purchasing habits of people when they go to a gas station and buy gas, and they're between these ages, and they're African American in these states. So they get incredibly detailed information. But we don't know that. We don't know how our user advantage cards are used when we go and do grocery shopping. And the challenge here is the ownership of the information, the way it gets combined with other information to create actionable data such as predictive policing or other kinds of governmental and corporate actionability. Those are hidden from us. They're opaque to us, as David was saying. Because they're opaque to us, when something occurs, we can't even tell how much of it is a result of information and how much of it is a result of gut decision-making by a politician, and to what degree those are mixed together. And because of that, we don't even know when to push back and say, wait a minute, we never intended for you to take the Social Security database and the immigration database and combine them. That's actually illegal, isn't it? So we don't even know when to push back because we don't even know how information is agglomerated, combined, sliced and diced, and used. So we're so many steps removed from the ability to understand the decision-making processes in society as more and more digital information becomes relevant to it, that it turns out only Freedom of Information Act requests by journalists are able to unearth some of this. But when does that happen? 7 to 10 years later. So it doesn't help us in real time fighting against kind of manipulations of power, but rather helps us just retrospectively study a situation and say, oh, wow, look at how that happened 10 years ago. And so that leaves us in the lurch from being able to, in real time, push back on policy.
I think that's also just a huge concern in terms of the lack of transparency, because even if you were to potentially push back, who or what are you actually pushing back against? Are you pushing back against a particular social media platform, a particular policing agency, a particular municipal government, a federal government? Where are you looking? And if you really are trying to agitate the system, so to speak, who is the recipient of that protest, right? Because otherwise it just turns into this relatively ineffectual noise, general angst, or a form of almost rioting of sorts, right? Whether quiet or large, that isn't necessarily going to mobilize change. And I think that renders individuals and groups relatively powerless and allows for this lack of transparency to persist. There's no target for the protest. It's very difficult to elicit any type of mobilized action or movement for change.
And I'll just, there probably are some people listening to this who are saying out loud, well, wait a second, what about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU? Or what about the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act that was passed last year? We don't have the time to go into all those details. I'll just say none of those things that have been passed actually tackle the kinds of issues that are being raised here. They start to nibble at the edges, but GDPR, CCPA, those are unfortunately not solutions to this general problem of the opacity of the uses of our data and information.
Well, David, you are correct where with some of the questions coming in, we could go on for another 2 hours. But I do have a couple questions here that I think are important. This person writes, scientists have, in all caps, always failed to appreciate the implications of their research and development. Consider the atomic bomb scientists. Why didn't the early computer scientists think about the implications of their work? Was it too exciting?
Actually, they did a little bit. It was too exciting, and their training was in maths and logic. Their training was not in ethics or history of science or philosophy of science. So they hadn't even studied the way innovation in the history of culture affected our grammar, our rhetoric, our dialogue, our discourse, and politics. They simply hadn't studied political science either. But go back to the nuclear arms race, and a very large contingent of computer professionals that I worked with became members of the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, CPSR. That was one really nice enacted example. But that example was precisely people who were out to stop the Cold War and to stop the idea of mutually assured destruction. And the oddity is CPSR died when Gorbachev created Glasnost, and we ended that kind of initial nuclear arms race, which now apparently we've begun again. Lucky us. So we have had examples like that have been large movements within the computer profession. None of them have led to curricular change, where the way we teach computer science curriculum is reformulated and made cross-disciplinary in a broad way. And that's essentially what David, Jen, and I are all advocating, is that you can't do this. You can't change the world unless you actually have studied history of science, unless you have studied history of technology, unless you understand critical inquiry. But that's not what we teach right now, because we've created hyper-specialization in our universities.
And to connect it to Jen's ideas about breaking down silos and the siloization, if that's even a term.
Not a word.
All right. Oh, well, I'm not a professor, so I don't know these things. Yeah, I think one of the things to recognize is, I think sometimes it gets framed as either we do nothing in terms of helping people to understand the ethical societal impacts, or every computer scientist has to be an ethicist and a sociologist and an economist. And there's actually an enormous middle ground. Certainly when I teach, I don't try and teach the computer science students to be ethicists of the level that I would expect of a philosophy undergraduate. What I try to teach them is how to talk to one another. And you can talk to people even if you can't do what they do. I can't do economics. I don't know how to do those kinds of analyses, but I can talk to the people who can, and I can learn from their experiences, and we can collaboratively do so much more than we could do by ourselves. So I don't think we need to retrain all computer scientists as ethicists or as sociologists, but we'd better teach them how to collaborate with and learn from and interact with people who do have the really deep disciplinary training in those areas. And of course, vice versa. The ethicists have to understand computer science well enough to collaborate back.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to, David, also is this notion of humility and empathy, as well as maybe an indication in their curricular experience of where the bright lines might be, right? So if there is a situation that manifests as something that renders a flagging, paying attention, pausing, really framing what that question might be, and then reaching out to experts in other domains who can really attend to the intricacies of that concern or that issue. But that notion of having even a tiny toolkit that allows you to recognize and acknowledge the bright lines, what the categories are perhaps of the bright lines. I would imagine this happens in genetics for students who are studying microbiology, biology, even perhaps biochemistry heading into the pharmaceuticals. There are certain bright lines, and equipping students with that so that they can then reach out and work with other folks across the disciplines is crucial.
Well, as is the case, I think, with any ethics week we do at Chautauqua, but particularly this one, we find ourselves ending with far more questions than we started with, which is exactly the point when we talk about the role of inquiry. I would love if we had more time. These are just, I will share some of these questions, by the way, with with you all, just so that you can see what else this community is wrestling with. But as we come to a close, I would like to ask, because we've unpacked so much today, and but with what we really hope to achieve with these conversations is for all of us to be thinking about how we can be thinking differently, think about the kind of role we play in this broader work. Is there a single takeaway from each of you, a single lesson or question, some kind of takeaway that you would like us, by the way, as educators, as parents, as young people who may be ready to enter school in the fall, a takeaway that you would like to leave us with as we proceed through this week of conversation and go forward during a time of tremendous challenge for this country and for this world. David, why don't we start with you? I realized I didn't pick anyone in particular, so could have all just exploded.
Nice to one another. The message that I would leave people with is, whenever you think about whether to bring a technology into your life, and you don't always have a choice about it, but oftentimes you do. Whenever you're trying to think about bringing a technology or a system into your life, think about what are the values that are really advanced or supported by that technology, and whether they're your values or whether they perhaps are supporting the values of people different of the company or of some other way of thinking about the world. And that's true for our children as well. If you're trying to decide whether to let your kid be on TikTok or Instagram, as a father of a teenager, I'm acutely aware of these kinds of decisions that have to be made. As you're starting to make those decisions, really think about values. What are your values? What matter to you? And what is it that the technology is going to facilitate, advance, or support? And whether there's the right kind of fit between those two.
Jen, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, I think the main principle came actually in the opening of the talk with the keywords. This notion of agency and individual empowerment, I think, is really important to, along the lines that David's pointing to, be conscious of the relationship that you have as an individual to these technological tools. Is it a tool that you're using, or are you actually becoming subservient to that tool in interesting ways? And if that relationship seems a little out of whack, really being mindful about how this is affecting your relationship to other people as well. So being conscious of those relationships with these tools, these machines, but also highly sensitive to the ways in which that might be affecting your interactions with other individuals or collectives.
Illah.
My final words would be read. There's some outstanding work that's anthropological in a way, specific industries or specific areas. I'm just going to name three, because Surveillance Valley, as in Silicon Valley, Surveillance Valley, will remind you how corporate America in the world of Silicon Valley operates with information and labor and digital labor. Mindless will remind you how AI and optimization and robotics have changed the game for how laborers labor in places like Amazon and Walmart. And then Drone Theory, which I mentioned earlier, will give you a really beautiful exposition on how the balance of power changes when you have autonomous and even remote-controlled drones in warfare. So I would just say read. There's outstanding text out there that will make you be at the heart of your next dinner party after COVID. Surveillance Valley, Drone Theory, and Mindless.
But they will make it hard to sleep at night.
Well, with that, now, Illah, Jen, David, I so appreciate your time, your preparation for today's conversation, the number of questions that you have left us with, and your final thoughts as well. And of course, I want to thank Carnegie Mellon University for the work in preparation for today's program. But thank you all.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.